"Don't get in the car." Little black boy shouts to millionaire. It turns out that the boardroom fell silent as the CEO, Marcus Hale, stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking on the floor, his suit tailored to perfection. He paused and pointed toward the machinery in the center of the room. "I guess we'll let our guest handle this," he said, a sarcastic smile twisting his lips. His gaze flicked toward Evan Miller, the young, working-class man standing beside the machine. Evan, the only black man in the room, felt the weight of their eyes on him. His hand tightened around the tool he held. "You're the mechanic?" Hale's voice echoed in the still room. "I doubt this broken contraption's seen hands like yours. Don't you have any better place to be?" The room erupted in hushed laughter, the executives exchanging glances, their mocking grins obvious. Evan knew they were only waiting for him to fail. But the moment he stepped toward the machine, the laughter died down, replaced by a charged silence. His hands were steady as he approached the malfunctioning machine. The executive's eyes followed every movement. They watched him, not as someone capable of solving the issue but as an object of their amusement. Hale's sneer lingered, the challenge in his eyes clear. "Let's see what you've got." Evan took a deep breath, his mind clearing, focusing solely on the task at hand. He knew the machine, he had worked on similar ones before. He didn't let their laughter rattle him. His calmness seemed almost defiant in the face of the ridicule. Without acknowledging the jeers, he knelt down, his eyes scanning the wires and gears before him. As his fingers gently worked through the machine's components, Hale's smirk deepened. "I can't wait to see how long you last, kid." Evan didn't answer. His gaze was fixed, and his silence spoke volumes. The air grew thick with tension, but he was resolute. Despite the insults, despite the doubts, he would fix this. He would prove them wrong. And though they had no idea, his quiet determination would be the calm before the storm. For 3 weeks, the machine had been malfunctioning. Evan had tried everything: resetting the components, tweaking the wires, recalibrating the system. But each time, the machine only broke down again. No one understood what was causing the issue. The factory had relied heavily on this equipment, and without it running smoothly, production had slowed to a crawl. Every hour of downtime meant the company lost thousands. And with the fiscal year ending soon, the pressure was mounting. Evan could feel it, the weight of the company's expectations pressing down on his shoulders. The executives had made it clear that their patience was running thin. His co-workers, most of whom were engineers and factory workers, exchanged glances, their discomfort palpable. They knew Evan was the best mechanic the company had, but this machine had become an unsolvable puzzle. Some of them whispered behind his back, while others looked away, unwilling to get involved. But there were a few who supported him. Janet, a fellow engineer, had watched Evan's struggles over the past few weeks, and though she hadn't said much, her soft sighs and sympathetic look spoke volumes. Mike, another worker, had once mentioned that they should bring in a consultant to take a look, but Evan had waved the idea off, refusing to admit defeat. "I can fix this," he had said, but the pressure kept building. Every time Evan walked into the factory floor, the eyes of the executives followed him, their judgment heavy. And every time the machine failed, his confidence chipped away just a little more. He couldn't afford another failure, not after the company had already lost so much. In the background, Hale's mocking voice had been a constant. "If only we could find someone with real experience," he would say, as if Evan wasn't even there. The silence that followed his remarks was deafening. Some co-workers would avoid eye contact, while others would nod along, too afraid to stand up to the power Hale commanded. But Janet, who had worked beside Evan for years, leaned over to him once as he walked past her. "You've got this," she whispered. It wasn't much, but it was something. Evan didn't respond. The words weren't enough to erase the knot that had formed in his stomach. What these people didn't know, what they would never understand, was that Evan had more than just technical skills. He had the knowledge and intuition passed down from his father, a mechanic of legendary repute. But he had learned long ago not to rely on others' perceptions of his abilities. His father had taught him that a man's worth was measured by what he could do, not what others thought of him. Still, the stakes couldn't have been higher. The company's future was teetering on the edge, and Evan was the only one who could stop the fall. But with each tick of the clock, it felt like the ground was getting closer and closer. Evan's fingers hovered over the machine's control panel, his mind quiet amidst the noise of the room. He could feel the weight of the eyes on him, the murmurs and whispers that seemed to grow louder by the second. But none of it reached him. Not anymore. The executives had no idea what was coming. They saw him as just another worker, another cog in the wheel. But Evan was different. His gaze shifted from the machine to the crowd, his eyes scanning the faces. Hale stood at the front, his arms crossed, looking on with that same arrogant expression. The others in the room continued to look at Evan with disbelief, as if waiting for him to fail. They expected him to crack under the pressure. But what they didn't understand was that this pressure, this judgment, was his element. In the midst of it all, Evan felt calm, as though the chaos around him was nothing more than static noise. His mind was clear, focused solely on the task before him. It was like staring down a storm while remaining untouched by the wind. He took a deep breath, his senses sharpening. The machine's broken parts had a rhythm. The hum, the clicks, the whirs, they weren't just sounds, they were a language. Evan had learned it over the years, the way the machinery communicated when it was working and when it was breaking down. He could hear what no one else could. The crowd's whispers grew louder, but they didn't bother him. Their impatience and mockery were like a distant storm, and Evan was the calm at its center. He knew what he had to do. He had faced challenges like this before. Only this time it wasn't just a machine. It was his chance to prove that he was more than just a mechanic. His fingers slid into the gears with ease, a quiet confidence in each movement. The tension in the room seemed to build, but Evan felt no rush. His actions were deliberate, each one calculated. The stakes were high, but in this moment, there was nothing he couldn't fix. The storm raged around him, but he remained steady. The others watched in silence now, unsure of what to make of his calm. They didn't expect this. They expected failure. But they didn't understand that Evan wasn't just fixing a machine. He was about to turn the tide in a battle they hadn't even realized had started. The room had gone deathly silent. The mocking whispers from moments ago were replaced by the sound of Evan's steady breathing. The machine lay before him, its disassembled parts now scattered across the workbench, a puzzle waiting to be solved. To everyone else, it was a mess of wires and gears impossible to fix. But to Evan, it was simply another challenge, one he had faced countless times before. He could feel the eyes of the executives on him, but it no longer fazed him. His mind was focused, his hands working with deliberate care. His fingers moved over the gears like an artist with a blank canvas, each motion purposeful, unhurried. The tension in the room seemed to build, but Evan remained unfazed, as calm as a lake before the storm. The machine had tested him, and now it was his turn to show it who was in control. For the first time since he had stepped into the room, a faint smile tugged at the corners of Evan's lips. It wasn't a cocky grin, but a quiet acknowledgement of what was coming. This was his moment, and it was about to unfold with precision. He wasn't just going to fix the machine, he was going to prove everyone wrong. Hale stood by the door, arms crossed, still looking skeptical. He had been quiet for the past few minutes, watching Evan's every move, waiting for him to mess up. But it hadn't happened. The ridicule was still there in his eyes, but the doubt was creeping in. The crowd of executives shifted nervously, whispering to one another, their confidence starting to waver. Evan's hands paused for a brief moment, his fingers brushing over a small panel on the side of the machine. He stood back and scanned the disarrayed parts before him. His eyes narrowed in thought as he looked at the machine's wiring. There was something here, something subtle but important. He had seen this kind of failure before, and it was almost too simple. He turned to the side, calmly asking, "Can I get a flashlight?" There was a brief pause, and then one of the engineers, surprised by the request, handed him the small tool without a word. As the beam of light illuminated the interior of the machine, Evan's gaze shifted to the faulty wire that had caused the breakdown. The solution was right there in front of him, a simple fix. The room fell silent as Evan tightened the connection with ease, the machine responding with a soft hum. He stepped back, wiped his hands, and glanced over at the executives. They had watched him for what seemed like an eternity, waiting for him to fail. But now there was nothing left to say. The machine was alive again, functioning as it should. A quiet murmur spread through the room. Evan had done it, and in that moment he had proven more than just his skill. He had made the first move in an unexpected power shift. The room, once filled with the sounds of snickers and whispered doubts, now held its breath in an almost eerie silence. Evan's hands moved with quiet expertise, the faint hum of the machine the only sound in the otherwise still air. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together, each click and turn a step closer to the solution. As the seconds ticked by, the tension in the room thickened. The crowd had initially laughed at Evan's calm demeanor, thinking he was just another worker out of his depth. But now, with every movement, his focus only deepened, and the machine began to respond. Slowly but steadily, it came back to life, each small success building toward the final moment. The flicker of lights inside the machine caught Evan's eye. He adjusted the wiring with precision, his fingers moving as though guided by an invisible rhythm, each movement fluid and purposeful. He could feel the gears turning, hear the mechanical hum growing stronger. It was working. The executive's quiet chuckles had stopped, replaced by wide eyes and uncertain glances. Hale, once so confident in his dismissal of Evan, stood frozen, his arms uncrossed, eyes narrowing as he tried to grasp what was happening. The machine, which had refused to cooperate for weeks, was now operating with flawless efficiency. The joke had turned on them. Evan moved with purpose, tightening the final bolt. The machine's humming grew steadier, and the flashing lights inside the control panel settled into a soft glow. He stood back, hands still, but his eyes never leaving the machine. There it was, the moment he'd been waiting for. The room was quiet now. No laughter, no jeers, just the sound of the machine working like it should have from the start. The executives, who had once written Evan off, now looked at him in stunned disbelief. The man they had thought was out of his depth had solved a problem no one else could. Evan didn't boast. He didn't gloat. He didn't even look at the executives as he moved away from the machine. His job was done. The machine was fixed. And in the silence that followed, the reality of what had just happened hit harder than any words could. The room had changed. The power dynamic had shifted. And in that moment, Evan knew the battle wasn't about the machine anymore. It was about proving something much bigger than that. The room was still, save for the steady hum of the machine that now seemed to fill every corner. The lights on the control panel flickered to life, brighter and steadier than they had been in days. A soft mechanical whir echoed, the sound that had been absent for far too long. It was working. The machine was fixed. The change in the atmosphere was immediate and palpable. The laughter from earlier had vanished, replaced by an eerie silence. The executives, who had once mocked Evan, now stood frozen, staring at the machine as if it were some kind of miracle. Hale took a slow, deliberate step back from the machine, his face contorting in confusion. His jaw clenched, and he muttered under his breath, "No way!" His eyes darted from the machine to Evan, disbelief written across his face. The smug arrogance that had been there only moments ago had evaporated, leaving behind a desperate uncertainty. The other executives exchanged uneasy glances, some unsure of what they were seeing. This can't be possible," one of them whispered, their voice barely audible. The murmurs of doubt spread like wildfire, and for the first time, Evan could feel the power shift in the room. The crowd that had been mocking him moments ago now stood in silent awe. Evan didn't acknowledge the growing tension in the room. He didn't need to. He simply stepped back, his hands still steady, his voice calm. "It's working now," he said evenly. "It was just a loose wire." His words hung in the air, clear and confident. The simplicity of the fix only added to the disbelief. What had been considered a complicated failure was now nothing more than a minor issue, easily resolved. The crowd had no choice but to accept the reality. They had misjudged him completely. Hale opened his mouth to protest, his mind racing to find an explanation, but his voice faltered. But how could you? He began, but his words caught in his throat. Evan turned toward him, his gaze unwavering. The machine just needed attention, Mr. Hale. Something most of you overlooked, he said calmly, his voice cutting through the growing tension. The challenge was no longer in fixing the machine. The real challenge had been proving his worth. The room was now silent, the executives watching as Hale, unable to counter Evan's words, stood there, helpless. The power dynamic had shifted irreparably. No one was listening to Hale anymore. The truth was undeniable, Evan had done it. As the room settled into a tense silence, the door opened once again. This time, no one expected the figure that entered. A tall, composed man stepped into the room, his presence commanding immediate attention. He was older, with graying hair and a look of quiet authority, but it was his calm, measured pace that drew all eyes to him. Evan didn't even flinch as the man approached. Instead, he stood taller, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at his lips. He wasn't alone anymore. His father, a man of legendary repute in the engineering world, had arrived. The crowd whispered among themselves as the older man walked with purpose toward Evan's side. His eyes scanned the room, then settled on Evan, who now stood at the center of the room with the machine humming quietly behind him. "I trained him," the man said, his voice steady but filled with pride. "He's been fixing machines like this since he was a boy." The murmurs in the room grew louder, the reality of what was being revealed slowly sinking in. The crowd had no idea who Evan truly was. They had underestimated him, dismissed him as just another mechanic. But now they were learning the truth. Evan's father was a master engineer, the kind of man who had designed some of the company's most innovative products. His reputation in the industry was well known, his name respected by engineers and technicians alike. And now, his son, Evan, was stepping out of the shadows, revealing that his skills were not just learned through books, but through years of hands-on training under the guidance of one of the best in the business. James Hale's face turned pale as realization washed over him. He had no idea what he had just walked into. The very man he had tried to belittle, the one he had mocked and doubted, was the product of an engineering legacy far beyond his comprehension. "Evan," his father continued, his gaze now focused on his son, "has the mind of an engineer. His work speaks for itself. He's always been more than just a mechanic. He's been fixing the future for years." The room was now silent. The shift in power had become undeniable. Evan was no longer the underdog struggling to prove himself. He was in control. And Hale, once the confident antagonist, now found himself caught completely off guard, his arrogance replaced with palpable uncertainty. The crowd looked on, their eyes wide, as the full scope of Evan's brilliance was laid bare. The game had changed. The underestimation of Evan had come to an explosive and dramatic end. The tension in the room had reached a boiling point, and now, Evan's father stepped forward with a stack of documents in his hand. The air was thick with anticipation as he slowly laid the papers on the conference table. "These," he began, his voice calm yet laden with authority, "were designed by my team over the course of 2 years." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the room. "And these were stolen, taken by the very man who has spent the last few hours belittling my son." Evan's father slid the original design documents forward. The shock in the room was immediate. The engineers, the executives, even Hale, couldn't hide their disbelief as they recognized the complex blueprints, familiar designs that had once been praised as innovations. But now the truth was undeniable. The documents had been altered, reworked, and presented by none other than James Hale, the CEO who had doubted Evan's ability to fix the machine. Evan stood still, his hands folded, watching the unfolding revelation with quiet resolve. He knew that this moment was coming. It had always been more than about fixing a machine. This was the moment of justice, of exposing the lies that had been hidden for too long. The executives exchanged stunned glances as they absorbed the weight of the evidence. Hale's confident posture, his demeanor of superiority, began to crack. His eyes darted around the room, looking for a way out, a defense, something to salvage his reputation. I don't know what you mean by this, Hale stammered, trying to regain some semblance of control. His voice wavered. These documents are... But his words faltered as the crowd turned their eyes on him, no longer listening, no longer caring about his lies. Evan's father didn't let up. This, he said firmly, is the same pattern of theft you've been using for years. You've been stealing designs, claiming them as your own, and passing them off as company work. And now you've done it to my son. Hale's face drained of color, and his arrogance melted into panic. He reached for his phone, his hands shaking, but it was too late. The crowd had already turned. The executives who once stood by his side now exchanged looks of concern, some even stepping back as they realized the full extent of Hale's corruption. Evan looked at Hale, his voice steady and unwavering. You don't get to destroy my work, my name, and get away with it. The words landed like a hammer, and Hale, once the commanding force in the room, now stood isolated, his power shattered. The legal ramifications were clear now, and the looming collapse of Hale's empire was inevitable. The room, which had once been filled with uncertainty, was now buzzing with whispers. Whispers that spoke of accountability, justice, and the fall of a man who had tried to bury the truth. 2 days had passed since the shocking events that had unfolded in the conference room. The ripple effects of Hale's exposure were still being felt throughout the company. The investigation was underway, and the legal consequences of his actions were becoming clearer by the minute. James Hale, the once untouchable CEO, had been fired. His career, built on lies and manipulation, had crumbled in a matter of hours. As for Evan, the fallout had been entirely different. The company had recognized his abilities not just as a mechanic, but as the exceptional engineer he truly was. His name had been cleared, and the recognition he had so long deserved had finally come. Evan had been promoted to head engineer, a position he had earned through years of hard work, dedication, and quiet brilliance. It was a victory he hadn't expected, but one he knew was more than justified. His skills had been validated, not by boasting or fighting for attention, but by showing up, doing the work, and proving himself when it mattered most. As Evan sat in his new office, the weight of the last few days slowly settled in. He looked out the window, his gaze distant as the city skyline stretched before him. He thought back to the room where it all began, where his abilities had been mocked and doubted. He had faced humiliation, but he had emerged victorious, not through anger or revenge, but through his quiet resolve. This victory wasn't about destroying Hale or taking his job. It wasn't about personal gain or proving a point to anyone. It was about dignity. It was about standing firm in the face of injustice and knowing that, in the end, the truth would prevail. Evan smiled softly to himself as he leaned back in his chair. It's about time, he thought, reflecting on the journey. It had been a long road, filled with obstacles and setbacks, but he had come out on top. The fight had been difficult, but it was over now. The struggle for respect, for recognition, had been won. He stood up, his heart lighter than it had been in years, and walked out of his office. The future was no longer uncertain. It was his to shape, and as he stepped into the bright light of a new day, he knew one thing for certain. He had earned his place at the table, and no one could ever take that from him.